My parents never said they were choosing my sister over me. They didn't need to. They showed it in the decisions they made, quietly, politely, and without apology. That evening, the rain was tapping against the windows, the kind of steady Seattle rain that makes everything feel heavier. My father stood near the kitchen counter, papers spread out like a financial report. My mother sat at the table, hands folded. My sister Lauren leaned against the wall, confident and relaxed. "Lauren," my father said, "Northcrest University is the right place for you. We'll cover the tuition. Housing too." Lauren smiled. She'd expected it. Then he looked at me. "Natalie," he continued, "Rainier State is a practical option. You'll need to handle the costs on your own." I waited for him to explain further. He didn't. "You're independent," he added. "You'll figure it out." That was the moment I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. In my family, love wasn't loud. It was allocated. And 4 years later, when my name was called on a graduation stage in Seattle, the people who made that decision would finally realize what it had cost them. The rain never stopped that spring. Seattle has a way of blurring seasons together, and that year felt like one long stretch of gray. I remember standing in the doorway of my bedroom the night my parents made their decision, listening to the rain hit the roof and thinking how strange it was that everything looked the same, even though nothing was. I had always known Lauren and I were different. Not in obvious ways, not in ways people noticed at first. We were close in age, shared the same last name, grew up in the same house. But where Lauren moved through the world with ease, I learned early how to stay out of the way. Lauren spoke and people listened. I observed and people forgot I was there. When the acceptance letters arrived, they came on the same day, just hours apart. Lauren opened hers first, Northcrest University. Private, prestigious, expensive. The kind of school my parents liked to mention when they talked about opportunity. I opened mine later that night, Rainier State University, public, solid, affordable. I was proud of it. I told myself that was enough. That evening, my father asked us to sit down at the kitchen table. He didn't call it a family meeting. He never did. But he spoke with the calm certainty of someone used to making final decisions. "We need to talk about college," he said. Lauren leaned back in her chair, already smiling. My mother avoided my eyes. "Lauren," my father began, "Northcrest is a big opportunity. We'll cover your tuition and housing. This is an investment in your future." Lauren thanked them. My mother reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Then my father turned to me. "Natalie," he said, "Rainier State is a good school. You'll do well there." I nodded, waiting. "You'll need to pay your own way," he continued. "Loans, work, whatever you need." "That's it?" I asked quietly. He frowned slightly, as if surprised by the question. "You're capable," he said. "You've always been." The words should have sounded like praise. Instead, they felt like distance. I looked at my mother. She smiled gently, the way people do when they don't want to argue. "It's not personal," she said. "Lauren just needs more support." I didn't respond. That night, lying in bed, listening to the rain, I replayed every moment that had led to this one. The birthdays where Lauren's gifts were bigger. The school events where her achievements were announced loudly, while mine were mentioned later, if at all. The way my parents worried about her future but trusted mine to work itself out. I wasn't unloved. I was assumed to be fine. And in that assumption, something quietly shifted. I didn't cry. Instead, I opened my laptop and searched for something I'd never thought to search for before. Full scholarships, independent students, Washington State. The rain kept falling outside my window. Inside, I made a decision I didn't tell anyone about. If my family believed I didn't need help, then I would learn how to live without it. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps this space grow and brings you more quiet stories like this. Thank you for listening. Rainier State University felt larger than I expected. Not in the way Northcrest looked impressive in photos, but in a quieter, more practical way. Wide walkways slick with rain, concrete buildings softened by moss, students moving with purpose instead of confidence. On my first day, I walked the campus alone. No parents, no photos, no sense that this moment needed to be documented. I carried a folder filled with forms I barely understood yet. Financial aid paperwork, loan disclosures, work-study options. At the student services office, I waited in line behind people who spoke easily about family contributions and backup plans. When it was my turn, the advisor looked over my file. "You'll need to take on some loans," she said gently. "And I'd recommend part-time work, maybe more than one job." I nodded. It wasn't discouraging. It was matter of fact. By the second week, my life had settled into a pattern. Classes in the morning, a campus bookstore shift in the afternoon, evenings in the library surrounded by quiet and fluorescent light. I learned quickly that exhaustion could be managed if you treated it like weather. Unpleasant, unavoidable, but not personal. Lauren texted me sometimes. Photos from Northcrest, arched windows, study groups and cafes that looked warm and welcoming. "It's intense but amazing," she wrote once. I stared at the message longer than I should have. Then I put my phone away. At Rainier State, no one expected anything from me beyond showing up. That anonymity was both freeing and lonely. Professors didn't know my name. Classmates rarely spoke unless they needed notes. I blended in easily. I told myself that was a skill. One night, after closing the bookstore, I stayed late in the library. The rain outside pressed against the tall windows, blurring the lights of campus into soft streaks. I was halfway through a reading assignment when a voice interrupted the quiet. "You're here every night." I looked up, startled. A woman stood a few feet away, holding a stack of books against her chest. She had silver-streaked hair pulled back loosely and an expression that was curious, not accusatory. "I work nearby," I said automatically. She smiled slightly. "I can tell." She introduced herself as Dr. Evelyn Hart, a professor in the sociology department. I recognized the name from one of my classes. "I've noticed you," she said. "You take notes like someone who's paying attention." The comment caught me off guard. "Thank you," I replied, unsure what else to say. She glanced at the open book in front of me. "Heavy material to be reading this late. I don't have much choice," I said. She nodded, as if that made perfect sense. That was it. She wished me a good night and walked away. But the encounter lingered. Someone had noticed me. Not because I was loud or impressive or struggling visibly, just because I was there. Midterms came quickly, long exams, papers stacked back to back, shifts extended when coworkers called out sick. One afternoon, halfway through a lecture, my vision dimmed at the edges. I focused on my breathing until it passed, gripping the edge of my desk. No one noticed. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment, back against the wall, listening to the rain and feeling something unfamiliar creep in. Doubt. Not about my abilities, but about how long I could keep this up. I thought about calling home, about telling my mother I was tired. But I already knew what she would say. "You've always handled things so well." So instead, I opened my laptop. I searched for scholarships, not the big, well-known ones, but the quiet programs buried deep in university pages, fellowships for independent students, for those without family support. I bookmarked everything. Over the next few weeks, I wrote essays late at night, words forming slowly, honestly. I didn't try to sound inspiring. I wrote about being assumed capable, about being trusted to endure. One afternoon, Dr. Hart returned my first paper with a note written neatly at the top. "Please come see me during office hours." My stomach tightened. When I arrived, she gestured for me to sit. "This is thoughtful work," she said, tapping the paper. "Not flashy, but grounded." I waited. "Have you considered applying for the Alderwood Fellowship?" she asked. I shook my head. I didn't think I qualified. She looked at me steadily. "You do." The words landed softly, but they changed something. For the first time since my parents' decision, I felt a shift. Not hope exactly, recognition. And in that quiet office, with the rain still falling outside, I realized something important. I wasn't invisible here. I had just been waiting to be seen. Dr. Hart's office overlooked a narrow courtyard where rain pooled in shallow silver circles. Ferns clung to the edges of the brick walls, stubborn and green, as if refusing to be discouraged by the gray. I stood just inside the doorway, unsure where to put my hands. "Sit," she said gently, motioning to the chair across from her desk. I sat. She didn't begin with instructions. She didn't lecture. She simply folded her hands and looked at me for a long moment, as if she were deciding how much truth I could handle. "You carry yourself like someone who's learned not to ask for much," she said. The words surprised me enough that I laughed softly. I don't think I'm very good at asking. She nodded. That's not uncommon, especially for students who've been expected to manage on their own. She slid a printed page across the desk. Alderwood Fellowship, Independent Scholars Track. I had seen the name before, briefly, late at night, half hidden behind other links. I'd closed the tab almost immediately. Programs like that were for students who had mentors, guidance, someone willing to vouch for them. I don't think I qualify, I said automatically. You do, she replied without hesitation. But qualification isn't the same as belief. That's where most people stop. She explained the process: essays, recommendations, interviews, a final review panel that looked for initiative and resilience, words I had learned to distrust because they were often used to justify neglect. This fellowship isn't about polish, Dr. Hart said. It's about trajectory. I held the paper carefully, as if it might disappear if I wasn't gentle enough. The application deadline was 6 weeks away. Those 6 weeks became a quiet test of endurance. My schedule didn't change. If anything, it tightened. Bookstore shifts, long lectures, evenings in the library that blurred together. I wrote essays after midnight, revising sentences until they felt honest rather than impressive. Dr. Hart didn't rewrite my words. She questioned them. Why did you choose this example? What are you trying to protect here? Where are you in this paragraph? Sometimes I left her office feeling exposed. Other times, strangely lighter. Lauren called once during that time. You sound tired, she said. Are you okay? I'm busy, I replied, which was true. I didn't mention the fellowship, not because I was hiding it, but because it felt fragile, like something that needed time before it could be spoken aloud. The night I submitted the application, the rain was heavier than usual. I sat alone at my desk, finger hovering over the submit button, heart beating too fast. A familiar thought surfaced, the one that sounded like my father. You don't need help, you'll figure it out. I closed my eyes and clicked submit anyway. Waiting was harder than writing. Days passed, then weeks. I tried not to check my email too often, but I failed at that almost immediately. Every quiet moment invited anticipation. Then, one afternoon, while restocking shelves at the bookstore, my phone buzzed. Alderwood Fellowship Application Update. I locked myself in the restroom to read it. I had advanced to the next round. I sank onto the closed toilet lid, pressing my hand to my mouth to keep from crying out loud. The relief was sharp and unexpected, like air rushing back into my lungs after being held too long. Dr. Hart smiled when I told her. This is where self-doubt gets creative, she warned. Don't let it. The interview was small and quiet. 3 faculty members, calm questions, no intimidation. They asked about my work schedule, my coursework, what independence meant to me. It means being trusted to endure, I said, even when no one checks whether you should have to. They nodded, thoughtful. The final email arrived early on a Monday morning. I was walking across campus, rain misting my face when my phone vibrated. Congratulations, you have been selected as an Alderwood Fellow. I stopped in the middle of the path, backpack sliding off one shoulder. Full tuition, a modest living stipend, access to transfer partnerships for the final year. I read it 3 times. That night, Dr. Hart called me. I'm proud of you, she said simply. There was a pause. Northcrest University is one of the partner schools, she added. You could transfer if you want. Lauren's school. The thought made my stomach tighten, not with fear, but with something closer to gravity. I'm not doing this to prove anything, I said quickly. I know, Dr. Hart replied. You're doing it because it opens doors. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Lauren. I accepted the fellowship quietly, alone in my room, rain tapping steadily against the window. For the first time, someone had said yes to me without conditions, and I was beginning to understand that sometimes that was all it took to change the direction of a life. The decision to transfer didn't feel dramatic. There was no moment where I stared at the ceiling and felt destiny descend, no rush of excitement or fear that demanded action. It felt practical. Northcrest University offered stronger programs in my field, better resources, wider access to opportunities I had never been encouraged to imagine for myself. That was enough. Still, when I clicked Accept Transfer Offer, my hands shook, not because I was afraid of failing, but because I was stepping into a space where I had never been expected to belong. The paperwork came first, forms stacked on forms, transcripts sent, housing reassigned. Dr. Hart guided me through it all with quiet efficiency, never asking whether I was sure. She already knew. I didn't tell my parents. Not because I wanted to hide, but because I didn't want permission. I had spent too many years explaining myself into smaller versions of who I was allowed to be. I didn't tell Lauren either. Some truths needed time before they could breathe. Move-in day at Northcrest was loud. Cars filled the narrow campus roads. Parents unloaded boxes. Laughter bounced off stone buildings polished by decades of prestige. I stood at the edge of it all with 2 suitcases and a single duffel bag, suddenly aware of how lightly I traveled. No one asked where my family was. That, oddly, was a relief. My room was small but clean. White walls, a narrow bed, a desk positioned beneath a tall window that looked out over a courtyard lined with old trees. Everything felt orderly, deliberate. Unlike Rainier State, Northcrest expected confidence. In classes, students spoke easily, about internships arranged through family friends, about summers spent abroad, about futures already outlined. I listened more than I talked, learning the rhythms of a place that assumed familiarity. When someone asked where I transferred from, I answered simply, Rainier State. There was usually a pause, then a polite nod. I didn't explain further. I learned quickly that fitting in wasn't about changing who I was. It was about not apologizing for it. The first time I saw Lauren on campus, it was entirely accidental. I was crossing the quad, rain just beginning to fall, when I heard my name spoken the way only family says it. Half disbelief, half certainty. Natalie? I turned. Lauren stood a few steps away, coffee in hand, eyes wide. She looked exactly as she always had, confident, composed, belonging. What are you doing here? She asked. I go here now, I said calmly. Her smile flickered. Since when? This semester. She stared at me, then laughed softly, shaking her head. Mom and Dad didn't say anything. They don't know, I replied. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of rain. But how? She asked finally. Northcrest is expensive, I finished for her. I know. She searched my face. Are they helping you now? No, I said. I have a fellowship. The words seemed to slow her. Really? She asked. Yes. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. There was no jealousy in her expression, no anger, just confusion, and something close to humility. You never said anything, she said. You never asked, I replied gently. We stood there for a moment longer, then she excused herself for class. No argument, no confrontation, just an unfinished conversation left hanging in the rain. That night, my phone buzzed. A missed call from my mother, then another, then a text. Lauren says you're at Northcrest. Is that true? I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I placed the phone face down on my desk. I wasn't ready. The weeks leading up to graduation passed quickly. My coursework intensified. The fellowship meetings required attendance. I was busier than ever, but not overwhelmed. For the first time, effort didn't feel like punishment. It felt like alignment. One afternoon, Dr. Hart emailed me. You've been nominated to speak at commencement. I reread the sentence 3 times. Speak. At Northcrest. At Lauren's graduation. At a ceremony my parents were already planning to attend, for her. I closed my laptop and sat still, letting the reality settle. I didn't feel excitement. I felt clarity. I knew I wouldn't tell them. Not yet. Some truths don't need to be announced. They need to be witnessed. And when my name was called, I wouldn't explain. I would simply step forward and let the quiet speak for itself. Graduation morning arrived wrapped in mist. Seattle's sky hung low and pale, the kind of gray that softened edges and muted sound. I arrived early, slipping through the side entrance reserved for speakers and honors graduates. My footsteps echoed briefly in the corridor, then disappeared into the quiet. My gown felt heavier than I expected, not because of the fabric, but because of what it represented. Years of effort folded into a single uniform moment. I adjusted the collar, smoothed the sleeves, and took a breath that felt deeper than any I'd taken in a long time. From the side of the stage, I could see the audience filing in. Families clustered together, arms full of flowers and cameras. Laughter rose and fell, names were called, hugs were exchanged, and then I saw them. My parents sat near the front, exactly where they always chose to sit, close enough to see, close enough to be seen. My father leaned toward my mother, saying something that made her smile. Between them, an empty chair held a coat and a bag. Lauren was with the other graduates, relaxed, talking animatedly with friends. She looked confident, ready. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. The ceremony began slowly, speeches that blurred together, applause that arrived on cue. I listened with half an ear, my attention anchored to the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Then the university president returned to the podium, and now, he said, "It is my honor to introduce our Alderwood Fellow and this year's commencement speaker, a student whose quiet leadership and resilience embody the spirit of Northcrest University." The words seemed to stretch time. I stepped forward as my name was spoken. Natalie Brooks. For a moment, the world narrowed to a single sound, the murmur of confusion rippling through the front rows. Then applause followed, tentative at first, then growing as I walked onto the stage. I saw it happen. My father straightened abruptly, scanning the stage. My mother's smile faltered, then froze. Lauren turned, eyes wide, recognition dawning slowly. I reached the podium. The room went still. I rested my hands lightly on the wood, grounding myself, and looked out over the audience. Faces blurred together. Strangers, classmates, families who had shown up for people they loved. I didn't look at my parents yet. "Good morning," I said, my voice calm, steady, unfamiliar in its certainty. I spoke about quiet effort, about the kind of work that doesn't announce itself, about students who learn early how to manage without drawing attention. This journey, I said, was never about standing out. It was about continuing, especially when no one was watching. The room listened. I talked about being trusted to endure, about the difference between being supported and being assumed capable, about how easy it is to confuse the two. When people assume you'll be fine, I continued, they often stop asking whether you should have to be. I paused. But there is strength in learning how to choose yourself, gently, consistently, without bitterness. I finally looked toward the front row. My mother's eyes were already wet. My father sat motionless, hands folded, gaze fixed on me as if he were seeing a version of his daughter he hadn't known how to imagine. Lauren stared openly now, something like awe softening her expression. "This degree," I said, "is not a declaration of independence from others. It is a declaration of trust in myself." When I finished, the silence lingered, thick, thoughtful. Then applause rose, fuller this time. People stood, not all at once, row by row, a slow, steady acknowledgement. I stepped back from the podium, heart steady, and walked off the stage without looking behind me. Backstage, the noise softened again. Faculty members congratulated me quietly. Someone pressed a program into my hand. Someone else smiled and nodded. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. My parents found me near the edge of the reception area. My mother reached me first, her voice unsteady. "Natalie, why didn't you tell us?" I looked at her, really looked. "Because I wasn't ready to explain," I said gently. "I needed you to see first." My father swallowed hard. "We didn't know." "I know," I replied. Lauren stood beside them, silent. "We never meant," my mother began. "I'm not here to talk about intention," I said softly. "Only impact." There was no argument, no raised voices, just the truth sitting between us unadorned. "I'm okay," I added. "I've been okay for a while." My father nodded slowly, as if accepting something difficult but necessary. "I'm proud of you," he said finally. The words landed without the force they once would have had. "Thank you," I replied, and meant it. I stepped away before the conversation could stretch into something heavier. Outside, the mist had lifted slightly. The air felt cool and clean. I stood alone for a moment, listening to the distant sound of celebration behind me. For the first time, my story felt complete. Not because it had been witnessed, but because I no longer needed it to be. And in that quiet certainty, I walked forward. The reception moved around me like water. Voices overlapped. Glasses clinked. People smiled and spoke in the soft, celebratory tones reserved for moments that are meant to be remembered. I stood near the edge of it all, holding a paper cup of water I hadn't touched, letting the noise pass without needing to enter it. Something inside me had gone quiet. Not empty, settled. My parents stayed close, as if unsure whether distance would make me disappear again. My mother tried to speak twice before finding words that didn't sound like questions. "We should talk," she said gently. I nodded. "We are." She glanced around, overwhelmed. "Later, somewhere quieter." I considered it. "Not today," I said. "Today is finished." She looked surprised, then nodded. That, too, was new. Lauren approached when our parents stepped away to greet someone they knew. She stood beside me, eyes scanning the room as if seeing it differently now. "I didn't know," she said quietly, "about any of it." "I know," I replied. She hesitated. "You could have told me." "I could have," I agreed, "but I needed to know I could do it without anyone holding it up for me." She looked at me then, not defensively, not with guilt, but with something like understanding. "I'm glad you did," she said. "So was I." Later, after the speeches and photographs and polite congratulations blurred together, I left the building alone. The doors closed softly behind me, sealing the sound inside. Outside, the campus was calm, washed clean by the earlier mist. The trees stood dark and still, as if holding the day in place. I walked without direction, letting my steps slow. For years, I had imagined this moment. The aftermath, the explanations, the reckoning. I had believed there would be something I needed to do once everything was finally out in the open. There wasn't. The truth didn't demand action. It just existed. My phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Hart. "You spoke honestly. That's all anyone can do." I smiled and typed back a thank you, then slipped the phone into my pocket. The following days unfolded quietly. My parents called once, then again. I answered when I felt ready, not because I felt obligated. "We didn't realize how much we relied on the idea that you'd be fine," my mother said during one of those calls. "We told ourselves that meant we were being fair." I listened. "That belief," I said, choosing my words carefully, "wasn't neutral. It shaped what I had to carry." There was silence on the line. "I'm sorry," she said. Not dramatically, not desperately. Just honestly, I didn't rush to respond. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. That was all. Lauren texted more often after graduation. Small things, observations, questions she'd never asked before. "How did you know when to stop pushing yourself? Did you ever feel guilty resting?" I answered what I could. The rest I let time handle. I packed my apartment slowly. Every item felt earned. Books with creased spines, a lamp bought secondhand, notes tucked between pages that marked the hours I'd spent becoming myself. On my last night there, I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, the room mostly empty. The quiet felt familiar now, not lonely. I thought about the version of me who had arrived at Rainier State years earlier, careful, unnoticed, prepared to manage without complaint. I felt tenderness for her. She hadn't been weak. She had been learning. The next morning, as I locked the door behind me, I realized something important. I wasn't leaving anything unresolved. Not every story ends with reconciliation. Not every misunderstanding finds perfect clarity. Some truths take longer to settle. But I wasn't waiting anymore. The chapter that had defined me for so long, the quiet comparisons, the assumptions, the careful shrinking, had closed. Not with force, with acceptance. As I stepped into the morning air, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Lightness. Not because everything had been fixed, but because I had finally stopped carrying what was never mine to hold. Leaving Seattle wasn't dramatic. There was no last look over my shoulder, no moment where the city seemed to ask me to remember it. The morning I moved, the sky was pale and undecided, clouds thinning just enough to let light through. It felt appropriate, unfinished, but open. My new apartment was small, quieter than the one before. A single bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a window that faced a line of trees instead of buildings. I unpacked slowly, placing things where they felt right rather than where they looked best. For the first time in years, I wasn't rushing. The days after graduation felt strange. My body still woke early, braced for urgency that no longer existed. I would lie there for a moment, listening to the quiet, waiting for the familiar pressure to return. It didn't. Instead, there was space. I started my new job a week later, entry-level, demanding, unimpressed by my story. My coworkers didn't know what I'd overcome, and they didn't need to. They knew whether I showed up prepared, whether I followed through. I did. Not because I was afraid of failing, but because I finally trusted myself to see things through without fear driving me. Some evenings, I came home exhausted in a way that felt clean, honest. The kind of tired that comes from effort aligned with choice, not survival. My parents called less frequently now, not out of distance, but adjustment. We were learning a different rhythm, one without assumptions. "I don't want to overwhelm you," my father said once awkwardly. "I'll tell you when I need space," I replied. "You don't have to guess." He laughed softly. "I wish we'd learned that sooner." So did I. Lauren and I met for coffee one afternoon, months after graduation. No tension lingered between us, only curiosity. She talked about feeling unmoored, about realizing how much of her life had been shaped by expectations she'd never questioned. "I don't know what I want yet," she admitted. "That's okay," I said. "You're allowed not to know." She looked relieved, like someone had finally removed a deadline she didn't realize she'd been racing toward. That night, walking home alone, I passed a group of students laughing loudly on the sidewalk, backpacks slung low, futures still undefined. For a moment, a familiar grief surfaced, the quiet mourning for the version of youth I never got to have. Then it softened. Not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't own me anymore. I used to believe healing meant replacing pain with joy, that one day the hurt would vanish entirely and leave something bright in its place. Now I know better. Healing is learning how to stay present without bracing for impact. It's choosing rest without guilt. It's noticing when old instincts surface and gently declining their invitation. The first time I turned down extra work without explaining myself, my hands shook. Nothing happened. No one questioned my worth. No consequences followed. That realization settled deeper than any praise ever had. I stopped telling my story unless it felt necessary. When it came up naturally, I spoke without embellishment, without defensiveness. My past became context, not a headline. And maybe that was the final shift. I wasn't defined by what I had survived. I was defined by how I lived now, quietly, deliberately, without apology. Some nights I still thought about the girl who learned early how to disappear, who believed being unnoticed was safer than being dismissed. I don't judge her. She did what she had to do, but I don't live there anymore. Now I wake up inside a life that doesn't require proof. I stay. The realization came quietly, not during a milestone, not in a conversation that changed everything. It arrived on an ordinary evening while I stood at the kitchen counter washing a single plate and a mug, the window open just enough to let in cool air. I noticed that my shoulders were relaxed. For years, they had lived slightly raised, braced for something unnamed, judgment, expectation, the need to explain myself before anyone asked. That night, there was none of it. I dried my hands and leaned against the counter, letting the thoughts settle. I wasn't carrying them anymore. Not my parents' expectations, not the comparison that had followed me since childhood, not the quiet responsibility of being the capable one. I had set it down somewhere along the way without ceremony, and nothing had fallen apart. The weeks passed with an ease that still surprised me. Work demanded focus but not sacrifice. My evenings belonged to me. I cooked simple meals, walked the same routes until they became familiar, let routines form without forcing them to mean anything. I stopped measuring my days by productivity. Instead, I noticed small things. The way morning light shifted across the wall, the satisfaction of finishing a book without rushing, the calm that came from saying no without explanation. My parents and I spoke occasionally. Our conversations were quieter now, stripped of urgency. They asked questions differently, less as a way to reconnect the past, more as a way to understand the present. Sometimes they got it wrong. I no longer corrected every misunderstanding, not because it didn't matter, but because I didn't need every moment to carry the weight of repair. Claire and I met for dinner one evening, months after our last conversation. She seemed lighter, too, as if she'd stepped out of a role she hadn't realized she was performing. "I think I confused being chosen with being known," she said, stirring her drink. I understood immediately. "They're not the same," I replied. She nodded. I see that now. We talked about ordinary things after that. Work, plans, nothing heavy. When we parted, there was no sense of unfinished business. Just space. One afternoon, I received a message from a former Rainier State classmate. She had seen my name mentioned in a university newsletter and wanted advice. How did you keep going when no one was rooting for you? I stared at the question longer than I expected. The answer that came surprised me. I stopped waiting to be rooted for, I wrote back. I started choosing myself in small ways every day. It felt true. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how much of my life had once been spent anticipating reactions, how my parents would respond, how Lauren would be perceived, how my choices would look from the outside. That constant outward orientation had shaped me more than I'd realized. Letting go of it felt like learning a new posture, one that faced forward instead of back. I used to believe forgiveness was the finish line, that one day I'd wake up without pain, without memory, without the echo of old words. Now I understand it differently. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's releasing the belief that the past still gets a vote. Some days, the old ache still surfaced. A comment, a memory, a reminder of how easily things might have been different. But the ache no longer decided my direction. I didn't need my story to end neatly. I needed it to stop defining my next step. The night I realized this fully, I stepped out onto my small balcony and looked at the darkened trees below. The air was cool, the city quiet in a way that felt earned. I thought about the girl who learned early how to stay invisible. I didn't feel sad for her. I felt grateful. She had protected me until I no longer needed protection. And now I could finally live without armor. What I no longer carry is just as important as what I've gained. I don't carry explanation. I don't carry comparison. I don't carry the belief that my worth depends on who notices. I carry something lighter instead, choice. And every day I wake up, I choose to move forward unburdened. That choice, more than any recognition, has become my quiet victory. There was a question that used to follow me everywhere. It didn't always arrive as words. Sometimes it showed up as a tightening in my chest when someone talked about supportive families. Sometimes it appeared in the pause before I answered simple questions about my past. What if they had chosen me differently? For years, I believed the question mattered. I imagined another version of my life, one where I didn't have to calculate every step, where rest wasn't something I earned only after exhaustion, where someone else carried part of the weight. That imagined life felt close enough to reach, but always just out of frame. I don't ask that question anymore. Not because it doesn't have an answer, but because the answer no longer leads anywhere useful. Choice, I've learned, is shaped by what we're given, but defined by what we do with what remains. There are still moments when the past taps me on the shoulder. A coworker mentions their parents helping with a down payment. A holiday invitation arrives with assumptions baked in. A casual story reminds me of what I never had. The feeling still surfaces. It just doesn't steer. I used to think healing would feel like closure, like a clear ending where everything finally made sense and stopped hurting. Instead, healing feels like orientation, knowing which direction to face when memory shows up uninvited. I face forward now. Work has settled into a steady rhythm. I'm trusted with responsibility that doesn't come with strings attached. I make decisions without rehearsing explanations in my head. When something goes wrong, I fix it. Not to prove resilience, but because that's simply part of living. The urgency that once drove me has softened into intention. That change surprised me. One evening, after a long day, I sat on the couch and realized I wasn't tired in the old way, not the bone-deep exhaustion that came from constant vigilance. This tiredness was temporary. It passed after rest. Rest used to feel dangerous. Now it feels deserved. My parents and I continue in a careful, honest way. Sometimes we talk about the past. Sometimes we don't. I no longer feel responsible for guiding them toward understanding. Understanding is their work now. When my mother asks questions that arrive late, I answer what I can. When my father apologizes again for the same moment, I don't rush to absolve him. I let the words exist. That's been its own kind of boundary. Lauren and I talk less often, but more openly. She once asked me something that surprised us both. "How did you know you'd be okay?" she said. I thought about it. I didn't. I answered. I just decided not to stop. The truth of that settled between us. I mentor a few younger colleagues now, quiet ones, capable ones, people who remind me of the version of myself that learned to disappear. They ask practical questions, but underneath them is always the same fear. What if it doesn't work? I never promise them success. I tell them something steadier. You don't need certainty to move forward, I say. You need commitment to your values, to your effort, to the life you're building, even when no one is watching. There's a kind of strength in that commitment. Not loud, not impressive. Durable. The question I used to ask, what if they had chosen me, kept me looking backward, measuring myself against a past I couldn't change. The question I live with now is simpler. What will I choose next? That question doesn't demand justification. It doesn't require permission. It doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. It opens space. Some days I choose rest. Some days I choose ambition. Some days I choose nothing at all, and let that be enough. My life isn't extraordinary in the ways I once imagined it needed to be. It doesn't revolve around redemption or recognition. It revolves around alignment. And that has changed everything. I don't need the past to validate me. I don't need my story to impress anyone. I am no longer living in reaction to what was withheld. I am living in response to what I value. That shift didn't happen all at once. It happened quietly, question by question, until one day I realized I had stopped asking the one that kept me anchored to who I used to be. And when I let it go, the future finally had room to arrive. The last thing I learned didn't come from achievement. It came from quiet. One evening, months after graduation, I sat alone in my apartment with the lights turned low. The city outside was muted, cars passing occasionally, voices distant, life continuing without asking anything from me. Nothing needed my attention, and for the first time, that felt safe. For most of my life, I had believed peace was conditional. Something you reached after proving yourself, after surviving enough, after someone else finally said you're allowed to rest now. No one ever said it, so I learned to say it myself. That choice didn't arrive with clarity or confidence. It came gently, almost unnoticed, as I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen and stopped waiting for understanding that might never come. I stopped waiting to be met where I was. I met myself instead. My parents and I exist differently now. There is no dramatic reconciliation, no sweeping forgiveness that ties everything into a neat ending. We talk, sometimes warmly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes not at all, and that's okay. I no longer mistake distance for failure. Some relationships don't need to be repaired into what they were. They need to be reshaped into what they can realistically become. That truth took time to accept. Lauren and I are learning, slowly, how to be sisters as adults. Not through comparison, not through roles assigned long ago, but through choice. Some days that choice comes easily. Other days it doesn't. Neither means we're doing it wrong. My life now is smaller than the one I once imagined, and larger than the one I was given. I wake up without urgency. I go to work without fear. I make decisions without checking whether they make sense to anyone else. When something feels wrong, I listen. When something feels right, I let it stay. I no longer confuse stability with stagnation. I used to think being strong meant carrying everything quietly. Now I know it means knowing what to put down. I've put down the belief that my worth depends on being chosen. I've put down the habit of shrinking so others feel comfortable. I've put down the idea that healing has a deadline. What I've kept is simpler: integrity, curiosity, the ability to pause before reacting, and the knowledge that my life does not need to look impressive to be meaningful. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the girl I used to be, the one who learned early how to stay unnoticed, how to manage without asking, how to be easy so no one felt burdened by her needs. I don't feel sad for her anymore. I feel grateful. She carried me until I learned how to carry myself. If there's one thing this journey has taught me, it's this. You don't need closure to move forward. You don't need approval to belong to your own life. And you don't need to be chosen to choose yourself. The life I live now didn't begin when someone finally saw me. It began when I stopped needing to be seen. That is the life that remained after everything else fell away. And it is enough.